Hello, and welcome to today's live stream. We are here with John Ragosta, who is historian at the International Center for Jefferson Studies, and also the associate editor of In the Hands of the People, Thomas Jefferson on Equality, Faith, Freedom, Compromise, and the Art of Citizenship. My name is Laura Michael Balderson, and I work in the education department. I'll be fielding questions today, so if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the comment section, and we'll work those into our conversation. And today we are talking about Jefferson's ideas on being a citizen in a democracy. So to start, Dr. Ragosta, can you tell us a little bit about the book, In the Hands of the People, and specifically where did the idea for the book come from?
Well, thank you, Laura. You know, in a somewhat difficult time for our nation, I think a lot of people are talking about civics education and how people need to know a little bit more about what it means to be an American, what it means to be a citizen, your rights and responsibilities. So John Meacham had this wonderful idea that Thomas Jefferson really was still speaking to us in the 21st century about being a citizen. And he asked if we could find Jefferson's words and his quotations on citizenship. So we found 11 different topics we picked out, from equality to voting rights to religion to compromise, wealth inequality, immigration, and beyond. And we pulled together language from Jefferson mostly, also from some presidents talking about Jefferson. John Meacham wrote an introduction. Annette Gordon-Reed wrote a wonderful afterword. I wrote short introductions to each of these sections. But I think the readers have agreed it's primarily Thomas Jefferson speaking to us about being a citizen in the 21st century.
Yeah, I've definitely found it helpful in my work to be able to just sort of flip to a specific chapter and pull out a quote carefully curated for me. But let's go ahead and delve into these topics that you mentioned and talk about some of these lenses through which we can view Jefferson's ideas on citizenship. And let's get straight to the meat. Let's talk about equality. As a slave owner, did Jefferson really mean all when he wrote those words, "All men are created equal"?
This is always the difficult question with Jefferson. He has this principle of all men are created equal, and yet we know that he doesn't fully embrace that principle when it comes to African Americans and to women. Yet one of the really important things, and I think interesting things about Jefferson's views on this and many other principles, is he understood they were aspirational. He understood that there would be movement over time and we would be grappling with these principles. And he talks about this. In one of the last letters that he wrote in June of 1826, he talks about the blessings and security of self-government, and he says, all eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. So he understands there's going to be movement in this area over time. And people take that Jefferson principle, this broad vision of equality, even when sometimes his sight is limited, but they use that broad vision to expand beyond what Jefferson could see. So women in the 1830s and the 1840s at Seneca Falls, Black Panthers in the 1960s, over 100 nations realized that Jefferson's words are really speaking to humanity, and they use that language. The other interesting thing is he recognized that when people failed to embrace fully the principle, that it was bigotry. He writes to John Adams in 1816, and he says, bigotry is the disease of ignorance. Education and free discussion are the antidotes. And so in an Enlightenment world where we're going to use our thinking and our reasoning and our education to expand our vision and expand our understanding of the world, we're really going to see a movement over time. So he sees equality as the key principle, both a right and a responsibility, because people have responsibilities, but he understands that the vision is going to expand over time.
Yeah, so Jefferson clearly believed that education had an important role in fighting bigotry. And can you tell us more about what he thought about education for the United States as a whole?
Well, it's a good question, Laura, because education is clearly part of his plan for a new nation, a new republic. He says there's no other sure foundation that can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness. And we don't often talk about Jefferson and education, but he has a very expansive understanding of education. He believes that there should be a system where you have basically primary schools, academies, what we would call high school and colleges, at the public expense, and that all free children, boys and girls, should go to the primary school. And that then after that, boys would go on to the high school and to the college, and the boys who couldn't afford education, because at that time only the wealthy really could afford to go to schools. The boys who couldn't afford this would go on at public expense, the smartest to the high schools and to the colleges. Now, we can see that as being limited, and it was from our perspective, but in Jefferson's time it was revolutionary that he wanted a public education at public expense for all boys and girls. And he thought that it was critical that they be taught civics, expound the principles and structures of government, because this would both assimilate people, would make them one people. We're citizens because we all understand this is our government that we've empowered, but it would also allow them to have oversight of the government that was created. But the other thing that Jefferson says that's fascinating is he realizes even then that people don't want to pay their taxes to pay for education, and he excoriates this idea. He says, you know, the tax that will be paid for this purpose is not more than the 1,000th part of what will be paid if we leave the people in ignorance. So he says, without public education for everybody, we'll have tyrants and we'll have, you know, a restrictive government. So we need public education at through taxes at public expense.
So moving then from education to a topic that we are still continuing to wrestle with in some ways today, what role does a free press have in civic education, going along with Jefferson's ideas there about educating people for civic involvement, right? And then furthermore, what role does the free press have in protecting the rights of those citizens?
Well, it is free press is part of the plan, because you have to be able to inform the citizens who are being educated about the government, about what the government's doing, and they have to have oversight of the government. And the only way that would work is if these educated people have access to the information through a free press. So when the free press is attacked, for example, in the Sedition Act, and it's made illegal to criticize Congress or the president, this is the period that Thomas Jefferson refers to as a reign of witches. And he writes to James Madison, sort of his trusted lieutenant, and he tells Madison, if the newspapers fall, republicanism will be entirely browbeaten. So if the newspapers fail, we can't run a republic, we can't run a democracy. So rather than the free press being an enemy of the people, he says that when the press is free and every man able to read, we are safe. So that's really going to be what protects this system of democracy, that we're going to have a free press and an educated people. Now, you know, Jefferson doesn't like criticism in the press any more than anyone else, and he's criticized heavily throughout his political career, and he sometimes wants to retaliate against the press, but he keeps coming back to this principle, and he says the agitation of a free press produces must be submitted to. So he recognizes that the free press is going to cause agitation among public officials at times, but it must be submitted to for the system to work. Because an educated people will use a free press to keep government under control.
So what did Jefferson think about immigration?
It's interesting because he thought that if we're going to have a free country, that basically anybody who supported the principles of America should be an American citizen. And he realized that people would be coming from all different nations, different ethnicities, different religions, and he says that they should be naturalized by taking an oath of fidelity, and that thereby they would require every right of a native citizen. So he really thought that people would be coming in, and that was fine, that that's what would build America. He has this idea of a melting pot before the term is ever used. He also, interestingly, feels that the United States has an obligation to take in immigrants. He says the laws of humanity make it a duty for nations to succor those whom accident and distress have thrown upon them. So he really thinks immigration is going to be a strength and a responsibility for the United States.
And then within that, welcoming people from all over to the United States, did he anticipate that the United States would become this same term that you used that we're familiar with, a melting pot of religions as well?
Absolutely. Ethnicities, religion, these were all part of the plan. He talks about this when he talks about the Virginia Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom. And he says that it was meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. Now, when I talk about this, I point out to people, there are not a lot of Hindus in 18th century Virginia. But he's recognizing these people are going to be coming in to America, and they're all going to become Americans. And for that to work, if we're going to have a country built on different ethnicities, different religions, it was also critical to have a separation of church and state. And he makes a big point. He says, you know, in Europe, they've been having these wars over religion. Oceans of blood is the phrase he uses, have been spilled over these ridiculous wars over religion, and it's really none of government's business. Government needs to get out of the business of monitoring people's religion or telling them, what was even worse, telling them what the proper religion was. That's tyranny over the mind of man, which he abhors.
So moving on to a big topic, can you tell us some about what Jefferson's thoughts were on the importance of voting?
You know, it's particularly appropriate at this time that we think about that the founders, and especially Jefferson talks about voting. He refers to it as the ark of our safety. That in other words, if we, the people, are going to control the government that we created, because the problem is the government trying to become too powerful. If we, the people, are going to control the government, the ark of our safety is voting. And he also basically talks about voter suppression, because he says that voting, the alternative, if people don't have the right to vote, is revolution. And so the way the republic works is when everybody has a right to vote and exercise it, he views this as a right and a responsibility, that's going to make the system work. But if you try to restrict it, if you prevent people from voting, that's going to lead to revolution. And he talks about equal representation. You know, again, long before we have one man, one vote, he says we have to have equal representation. And he goes on to warn people that if you don't vote, if you don't exercise those rights, lethargy is the forerunner of death to the public liberty. You know, and this all makes sense. If you think about the Declaration of Independence, if government derives its power from the people, from the consent of the governed, that's how, you know, power doesn't come top down anymore. The power comes from the people. And if we become a nation because one people, in the first sentence of the Declaration, one people are empowering this government, well, it's critical that that one people, all of them, exercise their rights to control that government. So voting is going to be a critical part of having a republic.
And can you also tell us some of Jefferson's thinking about wealth and equality in the U.S.?
Laura, this is one of the things that surprised me a little when we were pulling together the material for the book. I knew that Jefferson and Madison had exchanged letters about wealth inequality. And Jefferson talks about when wealth inequality between the rich and the poor in the nation, if we end up with an enormous inequality, that's his phrase, an enormous inequality, it will destroy the republic. It just won't work. Because in a republic, everybody has to feel like they're participating and they get some of the benefits and some of the costs. They pay taxes, but they also get some of the benefits from being in the United States. And if you end up with this enormous inequality, then it seems like there are people who are benefiting and there are people who are paying the costs. And so he talks about this more than I had known when we started looking at it. He says at one point that if wealth inequality becomes too great, the government should tax at higher proportions of property in geometric progression as they rise. So a geometric increase in taxes on wealth. And he's remarkably prescient in this regard. that wealth inequality was an extreme problem in the 18th century. It became much less of a problem in the 19th and 20th century, but we see it growing again. And he also explains why this is such a problem, and he compares sort of that 18th century aristocracy of wealth, more danger and harm than benefit to society, he says. So back when you had birth and wealth determined your success, he says what's needed, essential to a well-ordered republic, is the aristocracy of virtue and talent, which is scattered with equal hands through all conditions. So everybody, regardless of what your name is or where you're born or whether you're part of the nobility, everybody has talents, and they have to benefit from those talents for the republic to work. He also warns that if wealth takes over the government, that could be a great danger. He said this would pervert to their own oppression, the perpetuation of wealth and power in the individuals and their families. In other words, if somebody basically wants to use government to promote their own wealth and the wealth of their family, that's going to contribute to this wealth inequality, which would destroy the government because people won't feel like they're carrying the obligations and getting the benefits of the government.
All right, well, this next question is a pretty big one, and so we'd love to have you just really take your time and answer it in full. How did the presidential election of 1800 affect Jefferson, and what did he learn from that process?
You know, we're all familiar with the election of 1800 as being a critical election in American history. It's arguably the first election in history, certainly in the U.S. history, where we have a peaceful change of power from one party to another. George Washington had been president. He was a Federalist. John Adams had been president as a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson becomes president. He's a Democratic Republican. He refers to this as the Revolution of 1800. And he says that it's as important as the Revolution of 1776. But, you know, to understand that, you have to take a half step back and realize what a crisis the country was in the 1790s. In the 1790s, after the French Revolution, both England and France were trying to pull us into the European wars. We end up with the Alien and Sedition Acts, which today we think of as being unconstitutional. But again, this idea that it was criminal to criticize the Congress or the president. And dozens, scores of newspaper editors were being indicted and thrown in jail for criticizing the government. So both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the Adams people and Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison, they were really concerned that we might have a civil war in 1800 over this, you know, who's going to run the country. I believe that Jefferson really, once he's elected president, and then of course after the election, the Electoral College is tied. They're having problems with the Electoral College even then, and he is tied with Aaron Burr, who was supposed to be his vice president. And even Alexander Hamilton comes out and says, Jefferson would be better than Burr. Even Jefferson is better than Burr. Burr is a demagogue. He's a megalomaniac. He's a narcissist. You know, he just wants to be president for his own benefit. So once Jefferson becomes president, I believe, and I don't think historians have fully appreciated this, that Jefferson really realizes and takes to heart how dangerous things had been, how close we had come to really destroying the nation and running out the constitutional clock. Later, he makes light of that, but at the time, I think he's really chastened. And so one of the things that he does, which I think is essential and really is central to our understanding of the presidency today, is he takes on this idea that the president is the one official in the country who speaks for the entire nation and has to talk for all of the American people, has to speak and represent all of the people. So in his inauguration, he makes this famous quote, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. Well, I think political scientists look at that and say, well, this is a political speech. He was just making, you know, a political comment. There really wasn't substance to it. But I think this was really very important for Jefferson. He was recognizing that this was going to be central for the presidency to reach out to the entire nation. And then he follows through on this in his government. Very early on, Albert Gallatin, who's his Secretary of Treasury, and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do after Hamilton's had been Secretary of Treasury. And Gallatin writes to Jefferson and points out that the Treasury Department is the largest department of the government because you have these customs officers at all the different ports. And they were very concerned about people using their government position for political purposes. And so Gallatin writes a letter to these customs commissioners saying, look, you're still citizens. You have a right to vote. You have a right to have your political opinion, but not on government time. You can't use your government position to promote a political position. And Jefferson writes back, I approve entirely of this letter. So this is almost an early version of the Hatch Act, which is still relevant today. Unfortunately, the Hatch Act is ignored far too often. But here's Jefferson and Gallatin saying, yes, if the country's going to work, we have to recognize that government officials are still people, but they can't use their government position for political gain. And then he does this over and over again. He does this with the military. He was very concerned that the military was controlled by the Federalists and that it was improper to have military officers basically taking political positions. And so he creates West Point partially because he wants to change that situation, and West Point gets going. And we have this today. Military officials, it's part of the Department of Defense regulations. We recognize they can be political. We recognize they can vote. We recognize they can go to political rallies. They can't wear their uniform at a political rally because then that looks like they're using their position as a military officer for political purposes. And he does the same thing on religion. He and Madison go back and forth. Madison talks about this and says that, look, that people obviously are religious in their individual capacities as distinct from their official stations. And so he says that officials will be religious, and we can't stop that. We don't want to stop that, but they cannot imply that their religiosity is related to their official position. Their recommendations in that regard should express the true character from which they emanate, their private views, not their government position. So, this election, which, we're all familiar with the election. We know that it was a very nasty election. There was a lot of nasty rhetoric, although critically not from Adams and Jefferson. It was never the president or the potential president using that kind of nasty rhetoric. But it becomes the Revolution of 1800, this change of power from the Federalists to the Republicans. But we need to remember, they really almost destroyed the country in that political battle. And then Jefferson, to remedy that, to address that, really says, look, the president needs to bring everybody in, and we need to stop using our official positions, our government positions, for political gain. That was an anathema for Jefferson. So this is, it was a critical election in 1800.
Well, this will be our last question today, and that is, can you talk to us about Jefferson's Tombstone and how the design for that, which he designed himself, reflects his vision for the American citizen?
I think it's fascinating. Jefferson writes his own tombstone. They find a paper after he dies with his papers, and he says he wants his tombstone to read, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." And not a word more. I mean, he's telling people, don't put anything else on there. And if you're Jefferson, you get not a word more. If you go up the mountain, that's what his tombstone says. And, people often reflect on this, and I think it's worth reflecting on this tombstone. It's very different from most tombstones. Most tombstones talk about things that the people had done. You'd think he'd mention he was president, vice president, he was a member of Congress, he's ambassador to France. Tombstones talk about things that people did in their private life. He's a paleontologist, he's a gardener, he's an architect. All these things are important to Jefferson. And tombstones talk about their family. He's a devoted son, a loving father and grandfather. None of that makes the tombstone. He wants it to talk about what he did to help build the nation. Political freedom, religious freedom, and public education. And you ask what message we can take from that. I think there's really two critical messages in that. The first is that Jefferson really viewed his contribution and his generation's contribution was creating the United States and getting it up and running. And here he is saying that, look, to make that nation work, you need three things: political freedom, religious freedom, and educational opportunity. And it's a three-legged stool. We need all of these things. You can't have two and not the other. So when he talks about public education, he talks about a system of general instruction which shall reach from the richest to the poorest. So everybody's going to have public education, informed by a free press, because that will keep government accountable. Everyone's going to have religious freedom, from the Jew to the Mohammedan to the infidel to the Hindu, because that will end this tyranny over the mind of man, government telling you what to think. And so if people can think for themselves, we'll have enlightenment and an expansion. And everybody's going to have political freedom, an opportunity and an obligation. From the local government to the national government, people will participate, and the power for that local government to the national government, the state and the national government, are all going to come from the people. So this is the three-legged stool. But I think the second message that people can miss in that tombstone is it's basically forward-looking. Most tombstones are backward-looking. They talk about this is what this person did in their life. I think this tombstone is fundamentally forward-looking. Jefferson recognizes, he talks explicitly about how his generation had made progress in each of these areas: political freedom, religious freedom, and public education. But he also recognizes how they failed to reach the goal in every one of these areas. We certainly know they failed in the goal of equality on African Americans and women, and we wish Jefferson had done better, but he recognized that this was a goal that people would be aspiring to and dealing with over time. I think we're still dealing with it today. And he recognizes that each generation needs to make progress for the country to work, but each will continue to make progress, will be striving for that achieving those goals of political equality, religious freedom, and separation of church and state, and public education. It's going to be a development over time. I said when we were talking with the donors last week that I think it's a little bit like Martin Luther King's "the arc of the universe bends towards justice." So it's going to be this broad arc, but over time, each generation, will make progress. So we're still struggling today with those principles that Jefferson articulated that he struggled with. So I think the tombstone gives us a very good message for citizenship today.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today for our live stream, and we hope you'll tune in next week for more content here from Monticello.